Now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers momentarily. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I asked the Premier if he would release his schedule so that the public could know when he was meeting with lobbyists. The Premier responded that Nova Scotians he spoke to didn't raise the issue of Mr. Chrétien lobbying the government. Of course, we don't know which Nova Scotians he met with because he won't release his schedule. Later in the lobby, however, he told reporters that he would tell the public what they need to know when he decides it's important. Unfortunately, Nova Scotians have a habit of wanting to decide for themselves what's important, and rightly so. So again, I ask, will the Premier release his schedule so that the people of Nova Scotia can decide for themselves which of his meetings are an important use of government time and money?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, let me correct the Honourable Member. Mr. Chrétien was not lobbying our government, Mr. Speaker, but I appreciate the opportunity to go on to talk again about the fact that I'm very proud of the great work that we've been able to do to grow the economy of Nova Scotia by working with people not only from this province but around the globe who continue to see that Nova Scotia is on the right track financially. It's on the right track when it comes to starting a new life for young people. It's on the right track to start in the startup community, and I'm looking forward to continuing to embrace the opportunities that are out around the globe for Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's about transparency, and I draw the House's memory back to September 2016 when the Premier faced criticism from the province's Information and Privacy Commissioner. The Commissioner felt that the Premier was taking steps in his communications specifically to avoid having to disclose those communications to the public. The Premier responded to the criticism by saying, and I quote and will table, "I need to be able to communicate with my staff, and there are certain things I want to be able to tell them that I don't believe should be in the public domain." At least the Premier is transparent about the fact that he is keeping secrets. So why does the Premier insist that he is sole arbiter of what the people of Nova Scotia need to hear?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to remind her, Mr. Speaker, we were the government that, Mr. Speaker, all the loans that have been put out by behalf of Nova Scotians when the Conservatives were in power that were done behind closed doors in secret. We've posted all of those, Mr. Speaker. We're the government that put online MLA's expenses, Mr. Speaker. I'm the first Premier in the province of Nova Scotia to make it available, Mr. Speaker, for people to be able to look at our Executive Council. And we're going to continue to make sure we're open and transparent. But I want to tell the Honourable Member, I'm also going to continue to work with my colleagues in our government and work with the private sector to continue to grow good jobs and good opportunities, Mr. Speaker. Not only are we going to lead Atlantic Canada, Mr. Speaker, we're leading the Federation and continuing to move our province forward, and we're doing so by working side by side with the private sector, and we're going to continue to do it.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on her finals.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I will say it's about being transparent. It's not about being successful and doing well. It's about being transparent. When the Information and Privacy Commissioner said the government needed to do a better job of documenting its decision-making process, the Premier responded, and I've already tabled that, I don't agree with the Commissioner. Members of the media asserted that by refusing to release his schedule, the Premier was less transparent than any of his predecessors. The Premier naturally disagreed with them too and claimed that the people needed to be able to meet with the government free from scrutiny. Explaining yourself after you've been caught is not the same thing as being transparent. So, will the Premier accept the requests of the opposition, accept the criticism of the Information Commissioner, face the cold hard facts about his secrecy, and let go of the illusion that he is running a transparent government?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for her question. I want to remind her, Mr. Speaker, we are the government that is posted online. My expenses, Mr. Speaker, every expense on behalf of the province, I posted online so every Nova Scotian can see it. Continuing to make sure that the pieces of legislation that we have, Mr. Speaker, are out in public and people are able to assess those. We're the first government, quite frankly. We're the first government, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, where the Red Room comes live, Mr. Speaker. We can see it outside of this province. But I'm going to tell you, Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to work with the private sector to grow good jobs and opportunities. And the Honourable Member may not think it's important for this province to be successful, but I sure do.
The Honourable Leader of the Official New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to table pages 6 and 7 from a recent edition of the Cape Breton Post, which on 2 facing pages includes no less than 5 either official notices or news stories about the closing of emergency centres. Like this, and down in one corner, an official notice of 3 closings of the Glace Bay Emergency Centre room, and next to that, 2 news stories about the Glace Bay closing, about the one in New Waterford, next to that, a news story about the closing in Badek, and next to that, an official notice of 3 closings taking place on the north side. And so I want to ask the Premier, Mr. Speaker, now in the 5th year since his government has come to office, is this the best that his government has to offer to the people of Cape Breton?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question and continue to work with Doctors Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, we're very proud of the work we've been able to do recently. We attracted 100 new doctors in the province last year. Mr. Speaker, we know there's more work to do, continue to do. Fact of the matter is, for successive governments, they ignored the fact that the demographics are changing. They ignored the fact, Mr. Speaker, there was not a physician recruitment plan across the province. We continue to make those investments. We're going to continue to make sure that every Nova Scotian has access to primary health care, Mr. Speaker, which would include a doctor.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The annual accountability report on emergency departments makes very clear that the trajectory of emergency room closures since this government began has been like this: up, 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 and up. And so I want to ask the Premier, does the Premier acknowledge the fact, or does he dodge or divert or obscure it, that emergency room closures have got worse every year since he came to power?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank those healthcare professionals across the province who are continuing to work with our government to ensure that we have in place the appropriate infrastructure to provide the healthcare services that people want. I'm very proud of the expansion we're doing at the QE2, the redevelopment here, the fact that we're going to have collaborative care centres across the province. We have in our budget an investment to make that happen. We're going to continue to work with a team of healthcare providers to deliver healthcare service to Nova Scotia. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of the fact that we've been able to grow the economy. We've been able to keep more young people in the province of Nova Scotia. More Nova Scotians are feeling optimistic about their future in this province, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to deal with the challenges that have been ignored by successive governments. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, promoting this province globally.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the 4 years before this government came to power, the trajectory of emergency room closures in Nova Scotia was like this: down, 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 down. And the reason for this, Mr. Speaker, was the development of collaborative emergency centres, which turned the corner on rural emergency room closures in Nova Scotia in communities from Tatamagouche to Musquodoboit Harbour. And so I want to ask the Premier, what is the justification he has to offer for the fact that in the budget which is presently before this House, there's not one Liberal loonie put towards collaborative emergency centres?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, in his diagrams, he forgot to acknowledge that in those 4 years there was an exodus of young people out of our province. Mr. Speaker, he forgot to, in his demonstration, to explain what happened to the economy of the province of Nova Scotia under that watch. Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member spent many loonies he didn't have when he was in power, and our government has put this province on a good fiscal track. We're going to continue to move this province forward, Mr. Speaker. Not only are we a leader in the Federation, Mr. Speaker, but the global community is looking to invest in this province, and we're going to continue to work with them to make it happen.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Justice. We are receiving calls and learning that there is possibly a very serious incident that's happening at the Central Nova Correctional Facility, and words like riot and people being harmed are being used. It hasn't been completely confirmed yet, but it's obviously frightening, and it's something that we all know is very repetitive at this facility. So I'm just wondering if the Minister could please give us an update, confirm whether or not this incident at the Burnside Jail is true, and provide any details on it, please.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. There was, in fact, an incident at the Burnside facility this morning, Mr. Speaker. The policies and practices of the facility were implemented, and the incident was brought to a quick end.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, and I thank the Minister for that. We know that this is somewhat of a common incident that happens at this particular facility. And back in 2015, my wonderful colleague, the member from Inverness, laid out a convincing argument that a review should be undertaken at Burnside. Those updates certainly would be helpful, and the one-page explanation of the many incidents at the jail do not often provide enough information for Nova Scotians to understand what happened. So, after all, as the member for Inverness said, one of the core responsibilities of government is to ensure the safety and security of all citizens, and the citizens in our correctional facilities, staff and residents, are no exception. And so I'm wondering if the Minister will commit today to undertaking an independent review of the Burnside to finally identify real solutions to the problems at this facility.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate again the question and the concerns that my colleague has shared. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it is construction and reorganization and a different model of supervision that's being applied in the Burnside facility, Mr. Speaker. We're going through significant renovations there as we speak. This has led to some challenges, certainly, Mr. Speaker, but we continue to work with the staff internally. The staff continues to work with the residents of the facility, and we're confident, Mr. Speaker, in moving forward that the model of supervision being provided will in fact enhance public safety within these facilities.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, we heard yesterday the Council of Unions Healthcare Bargaining Unit has applied to have the Labour Board finalise the IWK Essential Services Agreement. According to the NSGEU, the employer has continued to ignore important facts from the healthcare workers and is still bringing new proposals to the table rather than working with what's there. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister of Health tell us why, after 2 years at the bargaining table, the IWK continues to bargain in bad faith with our healthcare workers?
The Honourable Minister responsible for Labour Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. What the member has laid out, Mr. Speaker, specific to the IWK, is the next stage in the labour negotiation process, Mr. Speaker. I have met with both parties, representing Labour and the employee. I've encouraged them to be diligent in their efforts to find solutions at the table, Mr. Speaker, and this is quite literally the next step, and we look forward to the outcomes of continued discussions.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And actually, to be clear, it's not the next logical step if the agreement could be reached at the table. There's no need to waste the resources at the Labour Board. Mr. Speaker, when questioned about this situation, the Premier said that no one is losing their benefits. Frankly, Mr. Speaker, that simply isn't true. These healthcare workers are being asked to give up their short-term sick leave benefits and to give over control of their health and dental plans to the employer. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister clarify if the Premier misspoke? Do these workers really stand to lose their benefits?
The Honourable Minister responsible for Labour Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with all due respect to my colleague, there is a process, Mr. Speaker, that we follow. And within that process, important to recognize that employees have those opportunities to file those types of steps, to take advantage of those steps within the process, Mr. Speaker. That's the process that is applied. That's the process that we're following, Mr. Speaker. It is out of respect to Labour. We continue to have that dialogue, Mr. Speaker, and I'm optimistic that we will find outcomes at the end of the day.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Fisheries. Mr. Speaker, last Friday in estimates, the Minister of Fisheries said that he would not endorse an application by the Lobster Council of Canada to secure funds to market Canadian lobster on the world stage. The Lobster Council of Canada was formed 8 years ago to lead generic marketing efforts for the Canadian lobster, and the only organization that represents the entire lobster value chain in Eastern Canada. All provincial governments and interested federal government departments have ex officio status on the Lobster Council, and I'll table that list. At the moment, 9 directors of the Council are Nova Scotia based. The Council believes it can secure millions of federal dollars to support marketing efforts. My question, Mr. Speaker, is why is the Minister opposed to the Lobster Council of Canada using federal money to market Nova Scotia lobster?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you very much, and I thank the Minister for the question. And indeed, we have a very effective marketing process in the Nova Scotia. We're leading the country in exports and the fisheries. We were in 3rd place 5 years ago. We're #1 in Canada now.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer, and I think I heard a promotion there. Mr. Speaker, the Lobster Council estimates that their members represent at least 80% of the export value chain of Canadian lobster. It appears that the Canadian Fish and Seafood Program is a perfect fit for the Lobster Council's mandate of marketing Canadian seafood. Even with the success of the Nova Scotia branded seafood as head, surely diversifying some of the marketing efforts would have tangible benefits for Nova Scotia harvesters. And the Nova Scotia members of the Council want this program. Nova Scotia harvesters want this program. My question, Mr. Speaker, is why does the Minister insist that he knows better than 121 members of the Lobster Council of Canada?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'll repeat my answer to the member. If he didn't hear it first time, we're #1 in Canada in export of lobsters. We're #1 in Canada for the export of seafoods in this province, and it didn't happen by accident. We were 3rd place 5 years ago. We're #1 in the country now with over $2 billion worth of exports.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, Truro News reported last month in December that the Minister of Agriculture met in a closed session with officials from the Nova Scotia Provincial Exhibition Commission Board and management, as well as area mayors and representatives, to discuss plans on how the province would handle the operation of the Nova Scotia Provincial Exhibition and the Truro Raceway. Later, the article stated that the province planned to split the provincial exhibition operations and the raceway. This is the 2nd time this same minister has reorganized the Nova Scotia Provincial Exhibition Commission. And last month, the news broke the minister would be separating the exhibition and the raceway. As a result of that, 15 people will lose their jobs. My question, is, will the minister explain why he thinks his 2nd reorganization of the Exhibition Commission will work when the 1st reorganization failed?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
The process with the Nova Scotia Provincial Exhibition is under review. Indeed, the facility under the past ability with what they had to work with, the people who were on the board had to work with, the facility was not making financial sense and was virtually bankrupt.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, another report by the CBC states on February 23, 2018, the minister said separating the Nova Scotia Provincial Exhibition from the Raceway is a necessary move to pool both operations out of their long-standing financial spiral. There's not really a solid financial management over a long period of time, the minister told the Truro Daily News. The Minister of Agriculture has failed the community and Truro Raceway and the Nova Scotia Provincial Exhibition Commission and the people of Nova Scotia by mishandling this file for 4 years. My question, Mr. Speaker, does the minister have a viable plan for the provincial exhibition property in Bible Hill, or is he simply reshuffling the cards?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you again for the member for their question. Indeed, we're moving on a path to put the provincial exhibition and Nova Scotia harness race in the Truro area in a solid ground, which we hopefully will have in the next year. We're working on that problem. It's been an ongoing problem for over 50 years. That the facility has never made money, and indeed, it's time that the place started to break even with a proper structure in place to do that.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of the Environment. Electricity is the single greatest generator of greenhouse gas emissions in Nova Scotia. We learned this morning at Public Accounts, the Department of Environment pointed to caps placed on greenhouse gas emissions from electricity generation as a critical piece of their climate change strategy. Under the cap, electricity sector emissions must be reduced by 55% by 2030, and that's certainly a bold target, Mr. Speaker, but sometimes we see with this government's plans, there's really not a plan. So I'd like to ask the minister, has there been any economic analysis done by the department to determine the cost of the reduction to meet the emissions caps?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're very pleased with the Auditor General report that came out nationally and that includes our province. It puts Nova Scotia among the leaders in the whole country in terms of how we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And in answering the member opposite's question, we are well on our way to meet the targets for both renewable energy and our reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Minister for the answer, but the question is about the cost of meeting the reductions. There's an agreement in place that talks about the cap and trade regulations that are coming, and the agreement for coal-fired electricity generation stipulates that the electricity sector emission reductions must be achieved in the most cost-effective way for ratepayers, and that's certainly a nice sentiment, Mr. Speaker. But what does it actually mean? So since the agreement is still just an agreement in principle, what certainty can taxpayers have that they won't end up paying significantly more for electricity? And so my question for the minister is, who will ultimately determine that the emissions reductions have been met in a cost-effective manner? Will that be the department or Nova Scotia Power?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're the only province in the Federation that actually has hard caps in our electricity sector. We're going to continue to use that hard cap. We have our new cap and trade system that will complement the system well, but I will say that under previous governments, under the NDP government, power rates rose by 30%. The PC government before that, they rose by 40%, and since our government has come in, those rates have been stabilized, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. During debates on Bill 72, the Minister assured us that his government is completely committed to inclusion. We've all been hoping to see evidence of that. An inclusive thing to do, and I would say a basic thing to do when preparing to respond to a report on inclusive education, would be to meet with the representatives of the 4,000 educational assistants, teaching assistants, community outreach workers who are on the front lines of inclusion in our classrooms. But sadly, we learned yesterday that the minister cancelled his meeting with CUPE representatives at the very last minute. Does the minister think that the implementation of the inclusion report can be valid or successful without the participation and expertise of educational assistants, community outreach workers, and teaching assistants?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In fact, that meeting was scheduled weeks in advance of the release of the Inclusion Commission. It wasn't about the report on inclusive education. That was not part of the agenda that was submitted to the department. We have indicated to all of those union leaders that we will follow up and reschedule that meeting. There was a scheduling conflict. But when it comes to actually meeting with those frontline workers, Mr. Speaker, we're actually going to be getting out on the road and meeting with them directly in each and every region of this province to talk about this report and its impacts positively that's going to have on the lives of our teachers and, more importantly, our students.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, the meeting was scheduled for March 20th, and if it wasn't on the agenda to talk about inclusion, it should have been. When justifying the Glaze recommendations, at first the government said they would create cost savings. When they had to admit that there weren't a lot of savings, they said it was to make improvements in the classroom. And finally, when they couldn't explain to us how calling principals managers was going to improve classroom conditions, they argued it was a necessary step to implementing the recommendations of the inclusion report. And now we have that report. So I'd like to ask the minister, can the minister point out for us precisely which inclusion recommendations required destroying our collegial teaching model and eliminating elected school boards?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'll actually point the member's attention to several pages in the report, pages 9, 11, 12, 16, 23, 43, and page 90, and I'll read one of those quotes. All of these are very similar. One obstacle to progress is the lack of clarity and consistency in how inclusive education is defined and implemented in Nova Scotia. For many years, the policies, procedures, terminology for inclusive education have been interpreted and applied differently from school to school and region to region. The report is all, this is the inclusion report, Mr. Speaker. In addition, inconsistency in how the program planning process is implemented across the province creates confusion and frustration for students, parents, and teachers, Mr. Speaker. So this inclusion report has actually validated the concerns that we've had in our fractured system. And thank goodness we moved on those, Mr. Speaker, because we would not be in a place to execute on this report in September had we not.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, a study in the Canadian Journal of Cardiology recently showed that if you live outside of the Halifax area, you are twice as likely to die after a heart attack. And Mr. Speaker, I'll table that report. Halifax is the only centre for advanced cardiac care in the province, and patients in other parts of the province can wait as long as 2 weeks to get a procedure that people in the Halifax area can get the same day. Mr. Speaker, this is a frightening statistic, and it is another reason why so many of our towns and villages are shrinking. So my question to the Minister is, does the Minister believe a system that values the lives of some Nova Scotians over others is acceptable?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. Indeed, establishing a single health authority in the province of Nova Scotia is one of the first steps we took, Mr. Speaker. Is a significant part of our previous mandate, and it's through that step, Mr. Speaker, that we use that to establish opportunities to ensure all Nova Scotians get fair and equitable health care services across the province, Mr. Speaker, as opposed to in the old model, which had 9 different organizations coming up with processes and prioritizing certain services very differently within those communities. So indeed, to the member's question, we're working hard with our partners, the Nova Scotia Health Authority, the IWK, to ensure we provide services across the province to all Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
You know, Mr. Speaker, it's very nice that the Minister always thanks one for a question, and I'd like to be able, at one point in my career, be able to thank him for an answer. Today's not that day, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Cape Bretoners have high rates of diabetes, high smoking rates that lead to high rates of vascular disease. Cape Breton is an aging population. With all of these factors, it is shocking that vascular surgeries are not being done in Cape Breton. And when the Minister gets up to answer, he's going to say, well, we actually have some services there. We have 2 part-time vascular surgeons. One of them is over 80. The other one's gone on a 4-month cruise of the country. And then there's a part-time doctor that comes from Halifax for 2 days a month. You imagine, Mr. Speaker. We should all be excited about that. So why is it, Mr. Speaker, why are Cape Bretoners being denied access to vascular surgery?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member again for the question. Mr. Speaker, the work that we do across the province to ensure that we provide health care services to all Nova Scotians. We recognize that there's more work to do in many areas of the health care system, and that's why we're continuing that work. We're working with our partners through the health authorities, but also our partners who deliver the health care services, physicians, nurses, and other health care professionals like our paramedics and pharmacists and others, Mr. Speaker. We continue to do that work. And Mr. Speaker, if the member wants to look at how these efforts have been paying off, you can look at the primary care results that we've seen in the Sydney area, Mr. Speaker, seeing significant improvements in the coverage of primary care access for the people in Sydney.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. My office has been working with a constituent who called us desperate for help after waiting a year for an appointment to be assessed for a hip replacement. She knows that after she finally gets assessed, she will face at least a year wait until she receives her surgery. I was saddened to tell her that she was still well within the average wait time, so it was unlikely that her need for care would be heard. Now, the Premier indicated, Mr. Speaker, last week that he believes that the province will get to a 6-month wait time for orthopaedic surgery this year. My question is this: why has this government failed in reducing wait times for orthopaedic surgery?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. First, I think I want to clarify one of the member's comments. I don't believe the Premier said that we'd be achieving a 6-month wait time this month. Mr. Speaker, the member may realize that in October we announced a new strategy for orthopedic surgeries, particularly targeting hips and knees, Mr. Speaker. Through that multi-year commitment, the Government of Nova Scotia has increased our investments. We've worked with this plan that was developed with the healthcare professionals and the NSHA, brought to government. Government found the resources, the financial money to support, and we're relying on our orthopedic surgeons and other professionals within the NSHA to deliver on that. We're seeing significant results, Mr. Speaker, over 400 additional surgeries in orthopedics since October. That's progress, Mr. Speaker, and we continue to invest more, and we're going to see more progress going forward.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, chronic pain can be debilitating. A year ago, my constituent was an active member of society, working, participating in sports, and going on hikes. Now, less than 18 months later, her pain has increased so much she is facing having to leave her job. We don't need a solution tomorrow, Mr. Speaker. We needed one yesterday. Wait times to see any specialist in this province are months long. As a result, Mr. Speaker, some Nova Scotians are going to the States for surgery. My question is this: will the minister admit that amalgamating health boards has created this catastrophe? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I would not make that statement, Mr. Speaker. In fact, what I'd highlight is that the success and the progress we've made, Mr. Speaker, in fact, as a result of having a single health authority. Mr. Speaker, the member opposite talks about the wait times for orthopedic surgeries. Mr. Speaker, those wait times existed long before we established the single health authority. And Mr. Speaker, if the member was to look closely, you'd recognize that one of the ways that we're making reductions and getting more
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
By getting more surgeries completed, Mr. Speaker, is not just with the increased investment, but by looking across the province and seeing where the opportunities exist so that we provide the services where the wait times are the lowest, something that wasn't optional or wasn't available under the previous model.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. For the thousands of Nova Scotians who receive income assistance, the chance of a better life gets harder as the cost of living keeps rising. I hear far too often from my constituents in Pictou County that the current level of funding does not allow them to meet even the minimal living standards in our province. The current levels of funding to provide housing are extremely low. If you choose to living in a rooming house, I will provide approximately $228 for a monthly rental. To put this in perspective, Mr. Speaker, a weekend stay at a hotel in Halifax will cost over $400. The question to the Minister: does the Minister believe that the current level of funding provided to Nova Scotians is adequate to ensure a quality life Nova Scotians deserve?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and I do want to assure him that we're in the process of making improvements to our income assistance program. For example, Mr. Speaker, I've been talking about this, that we're going to introduce a standard household rate, Mr. Speaker. That umbrella will come in next year, but we actually were able to, under this budget, introduce later this year a new wage incentive program so that people who work will be able to keep more of the money, Mr. Speaker. So in the past, there was a disincentive to work, quite frankly. Now they will get that. There is also, we've also exempted child maintenance payments from income as we calculate it for income assistance payments. We've doubled the poverty reduction credit, Mr. Speaker, and those are just a few of the things that we're doing in this budget, Mr. Speaker, to make it possible for more Nova Scotians have a better life. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, breaking the cycle of poverty requires the government to be a real champion of those who find themselves slipping through the cracks. Unfortunately, this government has been slow to address this segment of our population. There's not a day goes by that my office does not receive a call from someone who can't pay their light bill, heat their home, buy nutritional food, or have a roof to sleep under. It is these types of situations that add to the stress of the daily living with these individuals face. The minister keeps saying changes are coming this year or next year. However, when you're facing eviction or trying to keep the lights on, these words do nothing to elevate the stress they feel. My question to the minister: will the Minister of Community Services please provide the House with an accurate rollout date on a rejuvenated program?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, as I've indicated previously in this House, there are a number of things that are rolling out over the next year, and I gave those dates at the time. I believe it's August or September for the the recalculation of maintenance, for example. Later this fall, we will see the wage incentive. I would also want to share with the honourable member that, in fact, we do have grants going out to reduce poverty. We're working with municipalities, with community groups, and they're working on the thorny issues of poverty in their particular area to come up with innovative solutions so that, Mr. Speaker, we can make sure that all Nova Scotians have the opportunity to succeed and thrive right here at home. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. The Minister has pointed out that this government is investing just as much in film and television production now as it was before it cancelled the film tax credit. He sees that fact as demonstrating the government's support for the industry, but many people in the industry see it as demonstrating the government's incomprehensible policy decisions. Since the Premier broke his election promise and cancelled the film tax credit, working hours in the industry have plummeted by 60%, and I can table that. Mr. Speaker, does the Minister of Business think spending the same money for 60% fewer jobs makes good business sense?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe that our transition to the fund from the tax credit, first of all, created stability and certainty that we would see with respect to how we fund the film industry. Screen Nova Scotia has been a tremendous partner in the last year, for sure, with respect to how we communicate and how we've opened up dialogue on a number of different ways that we can help, Mr. Speaker. Mike Volpe and his team have been open to talking about ways we can help, from infrastructure, capital investments, and of course help rejuvenating the communications that we provide from the province and in partnership with Screen Nova Scotia so that we can continue to bring productions here. Mr. Speaker, film is important to this government, it's important to Nova Scotians, and we're going to continue to keep that relationship strong. Thanks.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, Screen Nova Scotia is working double time to prove to the world that we have incentives competitive with other provinces. But the fact is we are not getting the same scale of productions we were when we had a tax credit, and that is costing us a lot of jobs. There are productions that are shooting for 2 days here in Nova Scotia for exterior scenery shots and then filming the rest in Ontario because it's cheaper and the incentives are better. Our scenery is not enough. The incentive fund is not working. Will the Minister work with Screen Nova Scotia, IATSE, the Directors Guild of Canada, and ACTRA to improve the incentives that we offer so film and television workers can get back to work?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and without question, we are committed to working with Screen Nova Scotia, the film industry, the cultural industry. All of the players who participate and contribute to this industry are important to us. I did make the commitment yesterday to the honourable member that I would have any meeting that she thinks is important for the industry, and that she would be more than welcome to come along. With respect to the equity fund, or the incentive fund that we have, $20 million, which is budgeted for now. We've got a commitment through CCH to help on some of the writing perspectives, and of course we fund Screen Nova Scotia directly to help them build our reputation and continue to be a strong industry. So I will work with anyone, including the member, and we'd appreciate her support as we continue to strengthen the relationship with Screen Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Question for the Minister of Human Rights. Many organizations across the province have been denied student employment funding by the federal government because they chose not to make an attestation newly required by Prime Minister Trudeau because they were not comfortable with it. It had nothing to do with employment students would be performing. The organizations are not breaking any laws, but unless they agree to the attestation, they do not get the grant. Organizations like the Cape Breton Bible Camp, St. Patrick's CWL in Northeast Marguerite, and other non-faith-based organizations who are afraid to speak up in case other government funding will be cut off. Mr. Speaker, does the Minister agree with Prime Minister Trudeau that citizens are not allowed to have their own free conscience, and that unless they think the way the Prime Minister thinks, they are not entitled to government benefits?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to clarify some facts there. First of all, the organizations that are in question can have any beliefs they want. I will clarify that the individuals who are being paid under taxpayer dollars must not do any work that goes against the Charter of Rights and Freedom. And I'm sure the member supports the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Inverness.
It's a very short answer, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell you it will be of no consolation to the number of groups that have contacted me. Mr. Speaker, I'll give you an example. Some of the people who contacted me believe that an unborn child is a person. The attestation requires them to make an oath to say they agree with something they do not agree with. It is about their integrity, and credit to them for not compromising for what they believe. 2/3 of the people who contacted me were women. Put the shoe on the other foot. Imagine the federal government denying student employment funding to organizations that support abortion. Why is it right for Trudeau to deny a government benefit to one set of believers and not the other, but not the other? And if Prime Minister is wrong, will this government support a student employment program for those who are shut out?
Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Mr. Speaker, I will clarify that those organizations, no matter what their beliefs, are still open to hiring those students. Mr. Speaker, I will also add to the member, this is a great opportunity for me to talk about the cooperative positions in the province of Nova Scotia, which we've actually had an expansion to, and we're looking for more applications not only from students but from business leaders as well. So to the member, if you'd like more information on that, I'd be more than happy to share with him. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. This year, the federal Liberal government has started implementing a values test that tells people and organizations what they can and cannot believe if they want access to funding to hire a summer student. I've been hearing from many organizations in my area that they will no longer be able to employ as many summer students because of this attestation. A government treading on religious freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, or freedom of speech is completely unacceptable. The province offers a similar jobs program through the Student Summer Skills Incentive Program. My question for the Minister, can the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education confirm if this government is considering adopting the same discriminatory practice here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, we've had no changes to our programs. If the honourable member has any issues with the way our programs are funded, any specific part of it, if he thinks there's any enhancements we can do to actually attract more of our youth with co-op positions, which we know is a great gateway to keeping them in the province, to giving them the important experience they need to transition into the workforce. Once they start their career earlier, they have greater income potential as their career progresses, and that is the goal of our government and the goal of everybody in this House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Minister for the answer, and I'm pleased to hear his answer. However, that doesn't seem to line up with the Community Accessibility Program guidelines, as was pointed out to me by a local church, and I will table those guidelines. They are Community Cultures and Heritage Guidelines. Church sanctuaries are singled out as the only type of charity or not-for-profit organization that isn't eligible for government funding to make their buildings more accessible to people with physical disabilities. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct my question to the Minister of Communities, Cultures and Heritage. Will he confirm today that he will remove this discriminatory provision in the Community Accessibility Program that blocks churches from receiving these funds?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the member for the question. We have provided accessibility grants to churches, community halls over the years. We look at every individual application. If there is something in the wording in the application that needs a review, we'll certainly take that on.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, those providing hospice and palliative care in Victoria County cover 1,700 square kilometres of territory. For a territory this size, there's only one part-time hospice nurse and one doctor for 1 day a week, with no backup for vacation or sick time for both. The caseload remains steady at 22 patients, while other jurisdictions like CBRM, that has a caseload of this size, has a full-time nurse assigned to manage the work involved. As this government can appreciate, Most of the patients are remaining at home as per their final wishes, requiring extensive travel by our nurse and doctor. So my question to the Minister, could the Minister explain why there's such a discrepancy between two municipalities with the same caseload numbers?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. Indeed, I'd like to advise the member that in addition to the services that he's referenced, there's some innovative work in the palliative area, Mr. Speaker, where we leverage our emergency responders, paramedics to help with providing some of those services, and there's an ability, Mr. Speaker, for Nova Scotians to register for that service as well. So again, the services are being offered for palliative in a number of ways, and to help manage the caseload in our communities across the province.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, that may be the case, but along with this workload, it must be noted that other services that used to assist cancer patients, such as a chemo nurse and a patient navigator, are gone as well. As a result, it falls upon this part-time nurse and a one-day-a-week palliative doctor to spend time on the education component for the hospital, nursing home, local doctors and nurses. The result of these staff shortages is causing unnecessary hardship and stress for those patients and their families that rely on these services. So my question is, if the government believes and truly supports Nova Scotians receiving treatment at home, will the minister rise and commit today to making the hospice care nurse position in Victoria County a full-time position, the same as in other areas with the same caseload, and increase the palliative care doctor by at least one more day per week?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. He referenced specifically cancer patients, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to remind the member the steps that we've taken around cancer care, particularly respecting people who require oral cancer drug therapy, Mr. Speaker, that we've worked with our partners, Cancer Care Nova Scotia, to establish a fund to ensure that these catastrophic medications do not burden unnecessarily or to too great of an extent Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. We got that fund announced as part of our platform commitments, and we delivered that program earlier this year, retroactive to April 1st. These are the types of steps we're taking to support cancer patients in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Energy. Last week, Nova Scotians gathered at different events around the province to discuss the federal approval of British Petroleum's plans for exploratory ultra-deep drilling off Sable Island. The technologies BP is proposing to use have not been tried in waters this rough. Tide patterns would bring a spill into key lobster fishing grounds and right whale areas and could endanger George's Bank. The equipment to cap a spill would take over a week to get here from Norway, and the dispersants BP proposes to use on any spill could in fact increase risk to lobster. Mr. Speaker, what makes the minister so confident that the considerable risks posed by offshore drilling are being adequately mitigated?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. The CNSOPB makes me confident. The experience, the wealth, the history, the knowledge, and the commitment to Nova Scotia is what makes that board so important for the Department of Energy, for the government, and for all Nova Scotians. They know this industry. They understand that they can't ever avoid complete diligence on safety, on environmental protection, on environmental stewardship, and on the responsibility of BP or any company, Mr. Speaker. They're going to do the diligence. They operate at arm's length from government. They're going to make sure they get this right, and they won't give any approvals for anything until our people are safe and our environment will not be impacted. So I have full confidence in the CNSOPB, and they'll continue to do very good work on the behalf of the people of this province.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, the Attorney Generals of Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina have all spoken out to say they consider drilling an unacceptable threat to their tourism, fisheries, and prosperity, and I'll table that. Australia just recently rejected a proposal by BP very similar to the proposal here because it didn't meet their standards. And in Norway, capping stacks need to be on site within hours of a spill, not over a week like we allow here. Mr. Speaker, why should Nova Scotians accept lower standards than all those other jurisdictions?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reject the premise that Nova Scotians are accepting lowered standards with respect to the safety of the workforce that would be offshore, that have been offshore and that will be offshore potentially for BP should this project go ahead by way of approval and by way of viability. Again, the Canada-Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board, they understand what the concerns are. This isn't about BP, it's about the industry, it's about oil and gas and what practices are in place, what the conditions are of the environment by which they'll be operating, and they take in all factors, all considerations, all public reactions in any jurisdiction in the world with respect to Australia, the U.S. and other places. I don't have to have faith or any particular issue with companies. This is about our safety platform, and that is the CNSOPB.
Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move